you've alluded to a little bit already, and what was the state of the U.S. military?
Rather backwards, rather small, rather limited in ambitions and reach. As for the Navy, the model looking backward, you could say service branch is always game board the last war. And the last war in the case of the Navy was the Battle of Jutland between the German High Seas Fleet and the British Grand Fleet. So our fleet was full of old, battleships commissioned in the late teens and 20s. The Pennsylvania, the Arizona, the Nevada, all the ships that later Admiral Nimitz wouldn't have the fuel to deploy. They were fuel hogs, they were slow, they were obsolete. Why were they obsolete? They were obsolete because of the rise of naval aviation. They were obsolete because of more efficient means of generating steam propulsion to enable faster ships, cruisers, battleships, destroyers that could steam with the fast carriers. And so there's a revolution afoot. Even as Japan is designing to strike at our battleship fleet, the Japanese fleet is really the wave of the future. It's the Kido Butai. It's their own fast carrier force under Admiral Chuichi Nagumo that is going to be the world beater. World beater for how long? Well, the Japanese figured Admiral Yamamoto, the commander-in-chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet, forecast to his army compatriots. He said, well, if we're going to war, by the way, which I think is a terrible idea, Yamamoto had lived in the U.S. and seen our mills and seen our farms and seen our factories. He said, this is a terrible idea, but if we are to go to war, I will run wild for 6 months. And it begins with the Pearl Harbor attack, and it goes through Midway, and that's just about exactly 6 months. So give Yamamoto credit for foresight. He did not live to see the realization of his prophecy, but the Pearl Harbor attack was the wave of the future in the sense that carrier aviation is now the means of power projection for world navies. There were certain factions within the U.S. Navy that appreciated this. Even as early as the late 20s, through the 30s, our Chief of Naval Operations, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, Admiral Ernest J. King, conducted mock attacks on the Hawaiian Islands, mock Pearl Harbor attacks, 5-6 years ahead of the actual thing. And they were quite successful on the game boards. They were carried out, they were deemed feasible, but there's always this separation between plans and reality. There's this gap, and this gap arises from a failure of imagination. Science fiction writer Arthur C. Clarke credits this for a great many failures on the part of nations. This failure of imagination to actually imagine the reality that could set upon you if you don't do X, Y, and Z. And so as the war warnings pile up through middle of 41, as evidence accretes that Japanese intelligence is conducting reconnaissance of the berthing sites of the battleships in Pearl Harbor, there are all kinds of crazy claims that in some cases go as far as suggesting that President Roosevelt knew about the Pearl Harbor attacks. I don't think those are extremely credible. I think the best explanation is there was evidence that the Japanese had designs on Pearl Harbor, but there was a failure of imagination to imagine how actually they would affect an attack on such a spectacular base, which, by the way, it was a fairly controversial development when the decision was made to deploy the fleet from the west coast of the U.S. to Hawaii. This was part of the effort to convince Japan that we were serious about slowing them down in Asia, but it has the effect really of exposing our fleet to just the form of attack that falls upon it on December 7th. And it was a terrible result for the United States, and it was simultaneously a blunder of the first order on the part of Imperial Japan. In Tokyo, I assume they had no acquaintance whatsoever with Texas Ranger mottos.
well, but Yamamoto, what this famous quote, afraid we will awaken a sleeping giant.
Awaken the sleeping giant, and Texas was the right arm of that sleeping giant.
Absolutely everything you just said is spot on. For context, the development of the armed forces, though, was so far behind where we needed to be, as you alluded to earlier, in spite of the Lend-Lease program and the massive efforts to begin producing war material. Anybody who is listening or watching this should go online and take a look at films that were shot in Army training exercises in Louisiana a few years before the war, with tanks that were the size of Volkswagens, and it looked like a toy warfare, and that was the best we had. We had a cavalry that still believed that the horse was going to be important in World War II. And so we were very, very far behind the mechanization and modern military standards that were developing around the world at its roots just 5 years before the war started. And mobilizing and modernizing that military was a huge, huge task.
Yeah. So the Pearl Harbor attack changes the rationale under which young men from all across America enlist. Prior to the Pearl Harbor attack, it was largely economic reasons. It was post-depression. It was kids looking to get out of the Dust Bowl. But immediately, as soon as the bombs start falling, you have national honors at stake. There's a motivation of revenge, which is one of the most powerful human motivators. The sense of righting an injustice, of throwing one's own personal labor into a cause larger than oneself, when that larger cause is clearly just. And so Pearl Harbor, the Japanese awakened that on the American home front, and it began expressing itself rather powerfully in terms of the enlistment numbers. I mentioned the entire U.S. military in 1940 was under 500,000 men. In 1942, it was 3.9 million.
Wow.
Okay? And we're on our way to, but 1945, we're on our way to 12.2 million. So you can see the growth. It's almost a geometric progression, certainly in those first years, as, you know, I mean, it was so bad, it was so pervasive, it was so universal, that if you're a guy, if you're an 18-year-old guy, you wanted a girl on your arm at a dance, you better be in uniform. Right? I mean, I've heard that time and time again from everybody I've ever talked to of that era. You just had to enlist. It was just a question of which service. And the Navy had an advantage, I guess, with its attendant Marine Corps, as being the kind of the frontier corps. The Navy had the means of getting out there farthest. I suppose we were out there in the early days too far. The Asiatic fleet was destroyed almost to a ship. The saga of the cruiser Houston, the Asiatic fleet destroyed, taken into captivity in Burma and Thailand. And those guys every day in Japanese prison camps having the confidence and the faith that the U.S. Marines would come crashing down that gate any week now. It took a while, but we did get there. We did get there. And it was that sense of, it was that motivation coming from, you know, the world turned on its head in a hemispheric global injustice inflicted upon a sleeping nation. That was the energy, I think, for this enlistment drive, and it manifested itself also in the factories. Immediately, a survey of war industry workers in 1942 showed that 88% of them would be willing to add 8 hours to their work week just because the need was there. They would have happily extended their hours to do what was necessary. In the home front, you know, scrap drives and victory gardens and war loan drives and so forth were very widely subscribed to. And President Roosevelt knew what to do with this unleashed national energy. He and his war planners. Even private industry enlisted itself in the cause. You have any number of examples of, you know, private shipbuilding companies developing new classes of vessel, from the small LCVP troop transports and Amtraks, you know, to the larger victory ships, cargo ships for transporting men and material overseas. All of a sudden, in order to right this wrong of the Pearl Harbor attack, America is suddenly in the position of having to project its national power across an entire ocean. Well, two oceans, really. We had to supply Britain. Lend-Lease was in place. We loaned out destroyers in exchange for basing rights, which is a brilliant move by President Roosevelt, by the way, to secure long-term basing rights, which would benefit us all with the Cold War, would immediately give us an empire with a stroke of a pen, access to Britain's hard-won bases. But in the Pacific, we had to do it the hard way. We had to develop an amphibious fleet that could carry troops over thousands of miles of ocean, seize heavily defended islands, We needed to develop doctrine for amphibious warfare, doctrine for carrier aviation warfare, the use of not only aircraft carriers singly, but in groups, and how do you organize and how do you train your pilots to operate in such complex configurations. The discipline of total war was suddenly sprung upon us for the need to beat an enemy who was 6,000 miles across an ocean, in the form of Japan, and Germany was across an ocean as well. We're suddenly a maritime power of the first order because of this felt need to right an injustice and to save freedom in the name of really in the name of a vision that's very, very much embodied in today's United Nations, I suppose you could say. That's a byproduct of the war eventually, but it was an idealistic notion actualized and realized through bare knuckles combat for 4 years.
There's two points I think on the U.S. military, and one is to contrast that with the Japanese military, which had been seriously growing in strength and actually in combat since 1931. So they were highly disciplined, highly trained, and highly motivated. And the combination of having national pride in the expansion dreams of that nation, and the fact that the belief that their emperor was an embodiment of the descendant of the living God himself, that there was a religious component to it, a belief that when they died for their emperor, they were dying for their nation and for their God. And so there was that aspect of it is profound in understanding how strongly they were willing to fight. There's another side of it, though. You alluded earlier to the growth of the Japanese military since the beginning of the 20th century, in the Battle of Tsushima, and the reality is that as Japan was going through that period from the beginning of the century to World War II, there was profound changes going on culturally, with the military getting more and more control, even of the school system. So young children by World War II were actually being taught military mores and close order drill by the 6th grade as part of the actual education system. And so it was ingrained in the culture from the school system onward under control of the Japanese army. That a lot of people don't realize how ingrained that was in the culture by the time of World War II. And at the same time, Japan had gotten very adept at bypassing certain things that we expected them to be doing by building secret plants for beginning to construct military weapons we had no idea existed when the war began. From the midget submarine HA-19 we have on exhibit here, which was a total surprise to our naval engineers when they began taking it apart and determining how it operated, to the 400 series, the I-400 series, which was the super submarine, aircraft carrier submarine that most people didn't know existed, that successfully attacked, one of them successfully attacked the West Coast and firebombed the woods. And so they were advanced, very highly advanced in their development of military weaponry, in addition to having a highly well-trained and fervent corps of soldiers willing to die for their emperor.
That's right. And they had a considerable head start on all this.
That's exactly right.
Because of the war in China. So we're, at the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, their Naval Air Corps was expert. Their soldiers were well trained. They've got a corps of field grade officers who knew what it meant to maneuver a battalion and so on. And we had to learn all this the hard way. At the start of the war, the U.S. Army was still, electing its officers, weren't they? This was much to the chagrin of the Marines. On Saipan, they found out, that there was a peacetime culture that suffused the U.S. military. I'm not picking on the Army. The Navy was just as bad. It was a
but not the Marine Corps.
Never the Marine Corps. They're always ready for war. So the Japanese had all these years to not only train for war, but to practice war. Their navy, even though in China there were no real naval targets of interest, their navy, funded richly from the national coffers, the emperor's coffers, were conducting highly realistic training exercises at night, firing torpedoes, which we never did because, in nighttime exercises, you're liable to run into somebody, and that could get your career ended in a hurry. Peacetime psychology, right?
Yes.
So our captains are much more worried about colliding in an exercise and losing their next promotion than they are with learning how to fire a torpedo in a close formation. You see this in the results at Guadalcanal almost immediately. We get our tails kicked in the Battle of Savo Island. This battle occurs in August of 1942. It's 8 months after Pearl Harbor. It's post-Battle of Midway, mind you. Our Naval Aviation Corps kind of learned under the hard, fast-stepping tutelage of Halsey and his admirals. We win the Battle of Coral Sea, we win the Battle of Midway, but the surface Navy still has to get on a wartime footing. This happens at Guadalcanal. The first battle at Guadalcanal is Savo Island. We proceed to lose 4 cruisers and 1,000 sailors in one terrible night, being completely outclassed by the Japanese. And so our surface Navy's got to learn the discipline of war. We've got to flush out officers who are, fundamentally not war fighters in their bearing. So there's a personnel evolution that takes place, as well as a technological one, a doctrinal one. The Japanese, make good use of this head start. But don't forget Yamamoto's prophecy. He smashes Pearl Harbor. He rages through the Dutch East Indies. He takes the Philippines, and has 6 months, just as he forecast, until the Battle of Midway, when it all begins to come, when the expansion stops, and then the curriculum at Guadalcanal, the first Allied offensive anywhere in the world. It's ahead of North Africa. In the Pacific, in spite of the so-called Europe First strategy, Admiral King, through his foresight, secures the resources, not only to fight a defensive battle in the Pacific, but to take the offensive to Japan. And so Guadalcanal becomes the first Allied offensive against the Axis anywhere in the world. And it begins again with a catastrophic defeat. 7 major naval battles later, we've held on to that objective. We've thrown back the Japanese fleet. And we've done something really profound on a psychological level. We've demonstrated to Japan that we can take a shot in the chin, get up and keep fighting. Because honest to God, they didn't think America had that in it. To endure the privations of wartime, to take heavy losses, to sustain a couple of defeats, and then learn the lessons, get up and fight the next day. And that's exactly what we demonstrated at Guadalcanal, August, September, October, through November of 1942. Okay? We're not even 12 months out from Pearl Harbor. And we've had to affect this revolution in thinking, in military bearing, and in battlefield results, which are the result of this improvement. And so I think that's striking. I think that's very striking, how quickly Americans can adapt themselves to adversity, to change the way they do business on every level, and get better results.
No question about it. But what you just referred to regarding the Japanese and their mindset also goes back to the point earlier regarding their mindset of being racially superior. The Japanese propaganda referred to us as a mongrel nation, rather than being a pure, and they thought that we could not possibly be as good a fighter or as strong a fighter because of that breeding, is the way they felt. That's an important part of it. I think the other thing that, in talking about this, is astounding the success we had in turning things so completely, with understanding that the United States' entire focus during those early months was on actually stopping Hitler first. And the European first policy was ingrained from the very beginning of the war, and it was understood that we were going to hold until relieved throughout Asia and do our very best with what we had until they could begin that supply train to really crank up when the arsenal of democracy really kicked into high gear. And that's an important part of this as well, what valiant fighting was going on with very limited resources during that time. At Guadalcanal not being resupplied for all those months, and on the cuff establishing the Cactus Air Force, with any plane that happened to land became part of a group to protect that island in Henderson Field from the Japanese. The military's willingness, Army and Navy, to combine efforts and work together to defeat this enemy is really an important part of the story.